but how much of our supply of missiles for our own national defense has been depleted by this folly in Ukraine.
Oh, well, that's been an enormous drain on us. That's why the joke that came out as soon as we announced that we were going to have another package that President Trump was going to sign off on. That's in addition to the $55 billion that's currently under discussion. The joke was, well, nothing will show up for at least a year with regard to Patriot missiles and radars. And when it does, you'll end up with 17 minutes, if you're lucky, of air and missile defense. In other words, you just don't have the density of missiles that you absolutely need if you're going to provide any effective point defense, not area defense, point defense. In other words, you can't defend Ukraine, but you can defend certain points. Well, right now we can't even do that. And then when you start talking about a potential conflict with Russia, I think the NATO study that came out last year is still unchanged, and that is that we can defend perhaps 5% of NATO territory against air and missile attack from Russia. Well, that's nothing, Judge. This is all absurd. That's why the threats that we've been making are utterly foolish and empty.
If President Trump and Secretary Hegseth unleash this foolish General Donahue to take Kaliningrad, what will happen in response to the American troops in Europe?
That's Russian national sovereign territory. So we have to assume that that would be regarded as an act of war against the Russian state. If you pay attention to what's happened over the last few weeks in Belarus, there is an effective unification underway between Russia proper and Belarus. Unification in the sense that Belarusian citizens, there are only 8 million of them, but they can now vote in elections that occur inside Russia. They can hold office inside Russia. In other words, effectively, Belarusian citizens are being given all the rights and privileges of Russian citizenship. In return for this, you have these Orishnik missiles that are also deployed on Belarusian soil. That means that right now, in areas that are just west of Minsk, they can launch missiles against Germany, which would be undoubtedly one of the targets, given the numbers of forces we have in that country. And that would be impossible to stop because they're hypersonic and they would arrive within a few minutes. In other words, you're no longer launching from Russian territory. You're launching from Western Belarus. So the idea that you're going to successfully overrun and take East Prussia, called Kaliningrad now, is absurd. It's not going to work out that way. Frankly speaking, I don't know of any operation in modern military history where somebody said, we're going to attack this enclave that is heavily defended and we'll take it within the space of a day or two. I mean, it's just sort of absurd to even make such a statement. So I think it's nonsense. I think it was a bluff, frankly, and a very ill-considered bluff. And I don't know why the White House permitted it. You know, I'm assuming that the White House and Hegseth knew it was coming. If they didn't, then one wonders why Donahue is still on active duty. But that's another issue.
Well, they must have known of it because they didn't rescind it. They didn't neuter it.
Yeah, I think this is back to something else that we've discussed repeatedly, though, Judge. President Trump is someone who believes threats and bullying work. I think this is the product of his New York City life experience and the real estate market. And, you know, frankly, if you look at the White House right now and the people running things and surrounding Trump, it looks like the New York City delegation is running our country. So it may be that everyone is of one mind, that threatening and bullying is an inherently good idea and that it works. I don't see any evidence for that. And I think it's very dangerous, particularly with Russia. But I suspect that may be the mentality at work.
Well, before we get to Russia and President Putin and President Trump, your friend and colleague, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, agreed with his friend and colleague, Colonel Bill Ator, that the United States is a failing, flailing empire. Do you agree with that characterization?
Well, the administration is flailing, and I think they are ultimately failing right now. And that becomes more and more evident with each passing day. And you can go across the range of issues. There is no strategy for rounding up, evaluating, and expelling illegal aliens. There's nothing going on there. I mean, the stuff that happens is all impulse driven. I see no evidence for a serious effort to deal with the problem on a national level. That's one example. You can go through a number of them, but I think when it comes to our overseas presence, everything is impulse driven with President Trump. There is no strategy. I have never detected any strategy. When he took over as president, I think he's behaved as he has in the past. Now I'm in charge. Everybody has to do what I say. These are my ideas. We're going to go forward and implement them. And when he runs into opposition, he usually backs down. Then he tries something else. In other words, there is no coherent strategic framework that guides the application of military power or a national industrial policy. You see the same thing with the tariffs. Everyone who opposes me and what I want to do to Russia will have to face 100% tariffs. Then they suddenly back down and say, no, only 25% tariffs. Well, the next question is, why tariffs at all? Well, we're going to punish you, India, with whom we've had friendly relations for a long time, that is known to have good relations with Russia. In fact, India is a state you would turn to for help and assistance in communicating your desires, your goals, and interests to Russia. It's not a state that I would offend or alienate, but that's what we've done. And so Mr. Modi has said, thank you very much. We're not interested. Go fly a kite. The Japanese have said, we're going to buy all the oil and gas we want from Russia. It's all part of the same thing. There is no coherent strategy with attainable political military objectives. None.
A few minutes ago, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that it is now the public policy of Israel to use the IDF to occupy the Gaza Strip. If he asks President Trump and President Trump orders American troops on the ground to help Netanyahu, troops not there to feed Palestinians, but to kill them, what do you think Secretary Hegseth will do? And what do you think he should do?
Well, he'll implement the order. Everyone in Washington will. Do we have to go back over President Netanyahu's 5 standing ovations in front of Congress? I mean, who is in charge here? Let's wake up and smell the proverbial coffee. Prime Minister Netanyahu is, in fact, when it comes to these matters, President of the United States. He's in charge. Now, the question is, what do you do if you're in uniform and you're being ordered to do something that you regard as atrocious, as contravening, basic law of war and humanity? That's another matter. I mean, I'm sure that somebody somewhere in Army or Marine uniform, whether they're special operations or not, would have some questions on that subject. But as far as the people at the top, they're all owned. They owe everything to the lobby. They are going to do what they're told.